afternoon and welcome to BSI's Nature Markets Exploring International Perspectives webinar, which is part of BSI's Net Zero Week. The purpose of today is to hear from experts involved in nature and voluntary carbon markets across different geographies to understand progress they are making and how standards or best practice frameworks play a role in supporting this. We'll hear about local markets across both biodiversity and carbon, but also how global guidance can interact and help shape these markets develop. We'll touch on a few of the key initiatives driving markets to develop with integrity, including BSI's partnership with the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, ICVCM, and our work on nature investment standards that aim to increase private investment into protecting and restoring nature in the UK. Just before we start, I'd like to just run through some housekeeping points. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. First of all, I'm Anne Hayes and I'm here to chair the session today. Aside from that, this is a listen-only webinar, so your microphones and cameras will remain off for all attendees. Our panel will remain off until they're speaking, and then we'll all come back on together for the Q&A session at the end. But what we would encourage you to do and ask you to do is to submit any questions you'd like through the question button at the top right of the screen. And we will address as many of the questions as we can following the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please report them through the same question box and our team will help you as quickly as they can. Upon completing the webinar, it'd be great if you could fill in our feedback survey. We're really keen to get your feedback and input into how we can improve and what we can change, so please do that. And this is a CPD accredited webinar, so once you've completed the survey, you will be able to get your certificate. And we will put up a little bit of bit more information at the end on other events that we've got coming through this week. So moving on to the panel. Today we're going to hear from Kate Busuttil, Head of Standards at BSI, on how global frameworks such as ICVCM and BSI's nature investment standards play a role in developing high integrity markets. We'll hear from Ross Johnson, Head of Natural Capital Policy and Valuation for the Scottish Government, on Scottish nature market development and their interaction with standards. From Tom Butterworth, the Director of ARUP, on UK biodiversity markets and biodiversity net gain markets and some of the key standards underpinning these. And lastly, from Sean Doyle, microbial ecologist at the Water Institute, on how blue carbon markets are emerging in Louisiana with a focus on integrity. So I'm grateful to all our speakers and I really hope that you enjoy the session we've got today. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Kate.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everybody for listening today. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you all know, we're facing some real issues on climate change, loss of forests, loss of biodiversity, and so on. And these are some issues that need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Now, at the last COP, COP29, countries committed to delivering around $300 billion per year in international climate finance by 2035. However, at the same time, they've simultaneously acknowledged the fact that we actually need $1.3 trillion per year in the same time frame to address these issues. So clearly there is a huge shortfall in the finance required to take action on climate issues, and this is where credits come in, for example. Credits can channel in much needed finance from the private sector into climate mitigation activities across the globe. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about in terms of nature markets? Well, nature markets can include areas such as woodlands, hedgerows, peatlands, marine, and they can deliver on projects that work on carbon sequestration, biodiversity uplift, nutrient reduction, and so on. So that's more or less what we're talking about when we're talking about carbon credits or other credits in nature markets. Next slide, please. And where do standards come in? So we've said we need the money, we said we need those projects to start taking place, but actually it is also important to have standards in place, because having standards sets a common and agreed way of operating. It helps build trust, build that market confidence. And also, once you've got that trust, once you've got that market confidence, everyone's working to the same way, that's when you start to get investment coming into projects, as we said, that will generally protect or improve nature and lead to sustainable development as well. And there are initiatives happening at all levels. There are local initiatives, and I think we'll be hearing a few of those today. There are some happening at the national level and also some at the international level. And if you can go to the next slide, please. I'll just briefly touch on one that's happening at the national level, and I'll only briefly touch on it because I know one of my colleagues on the panel will be also touching on this as well. So I'm not going into too much detail here. But just to say, at the national level, we do have the Nature Investment Standards Framework that BSI has been running, and that is funded by the UK government. And at the moment, there is a programme of work for 5 standards to be put in place. The first standard is already published and it's ready now for people to use, and that's BSI Flex 701, and it's an overarching framework. Other standards will be coming through in 2026, early 2026, and also later in 2026. But as I said, other people on the panel will be touching on this a little bit more, so I won't go into too much detail on the Nature Investment Standards Framework. In terms of what's happening at the international level, we do have work happening at ISO, and again, I'm just going to touch on this because I know someone on the panel is going to talk about it, but there is a biodiversity standard happening at the international level. So there is work happening at ISO, for example. But what I wanted to touch on more today is ICVCM. And ICVCM is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. It was set up around 2021. And BSI has been working in partnership with ICVCM ever since it was set up. And we've been providing expertise on standardization, on public consultations, and helping them really put together a threshold standard. So who are the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets? So the Integrity Council is an independent global non-profit governance body for the carbon markets. And its vision is for the carbon market where if there is integrity, then scale will naturally follow. That is what the IC, the Integrity Council, wants to see. Next slide, please. So what's been achieved so far? I said it was set up in 2021, and we worked quite heavily on setting all of that up, putting all the people in place, all the technical expertise. And in 2023, ICVCM published the Core Carbon Principles. So these are 10 core carbon principles, or CCPs as they call them, that set a global benchmark to ensure integrity in the voluntary carbon market. They are a threshold, and they're used to assess carbon crediting programs and methodologies, and they're used in conjunction with assessment framework. And the assessment framework actually provides the detail around the criteria and requirements that are needed to meet the core carbon principles. As you can see here, there are 10, as I just said, and they're sort of split into 3 groups. You've got 4 on governance, making sure there is effective governance in place, that there's tracking, transparency, robust independent third-party validation and verification. You've got a group around emissions impact and making sure there is it is an additional piece of work. How permanent is it? The robust quantification is needed of emissions reductions and removals, and make sure there's no double counting. But also having the tools and procedures in place to ensure sustainable development benefits and safeguards, and contributing to the net zero transition. And the assessment framework is it covers 2 aspects. It covers carbon crediting programs, make sure they have the good governance around these issues, make sure they've got the robust processes in place, the tools and procedures, but it also covers it at the methodology level. So the criteria set out requirements for additionality, for permanence, for robust quantification, double counting, and so on, for the methodologies. Next slide, please. So how does the assessment work? And I'm not going to go into this into too much detail because this is more of a ICVCM side of things, and we provide standardization expertise. But basically the way the assessment works is it's a 2-tick process. So A carbon crediting programme will apply to ICVCM. They're assessed for their adherence to the governance CCPs, and the board will then approve them as CCP eligible. But that is not the whole story. As I said, it's a two-tick process, so a programme can only tag credits with a CCP label once both the programme itself and the methodologies used to generate credits have been approved by Integrity Council. So the second part of this is that the methodologies are sorted into groups of similar types. They're assessed by the experts at ICVCM for adherence to the CCPs, and they are classified as CCP approved. And it's only when you have both of these layers that the programs can issue the CCP labeled credits. Next slide, please. So just briefly, I'm not going into a huge amount of detail of where the assessment is in terms of the VCM, but all major carbon crediting programs are now CCP eligible. There are more still under assessment, but as I said just now, the two-tick process means that, excuse me, although they are CCP eligible programs, they can only issue CCP label credits if they were generated using approved methodologies. And on the next slide, you'll see some of those approved methodologies that are out there. Again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but this is just to give you an example of the types of methodologies that are actually eligible. Next slide, please. So where have ICVCM got to in terms of assessing the market? Well, they've done about 45% of the market already. They're still assessing carbon credit methodologies for adherence to the CCPs, expecting to finish around the end of this year. So next slide, please. So as I said, assessment is currently ongoing at ICVCM. There is, of course, a lot of stakeholder engagement at the same time. So ICVCM are engaging with all the stakeholders in the market, including the VCM practitioners, governments, regulators, indigenous peoples and local communities. But they're also looking to continuous improvement. They're working to ensure that the carbon programs and projects increase ambition over time. So there are programs in place which are still looking at areas not necessarily covered by the CCPs at this point in time, or that require further work, further thought. So there's a lot of activity going on. And as you can imagine, the market is evolving, there's innovation happening. So these are all the considerations that ICVCM are still looking at and looking towards what's going to happen in the future to the CCPs and assessment framework. So I want to finish my presentation with basically the last three slides, which concentrate more on how it's a global initiative and who is actually involved. I'll keep talking about ICVCM, and I keep saying they, this and that, but who are ICVCM? So the governing board, who make all the decisions, they are representatives from key stakeholder groups. You've got experts in carbon market methodologies and sustainable finance, environmental NGOs and philanthropy. You've got UNFCCC expertise, regulatory affairs, corporate sector, science and academia, and so on and so forth. We do have seats specifically for the indigenous peoples and local communities there, and we have seats for the market representatives as well. So the governing board is assisted with expertise. If you can go to the next slide. And it's assisted by a very large panel of experts. And as you can see here, we have technical experts from Global North, from Global South. It's a truly global set of people who provide that expertise in different subject areas according to what they're working on. So we're really quite proud of having all of this expertise in place. And my last slide I'd like to finish on is actually around the Indigenous People and Local Communities Engagement Forum. These provide that voice to Indigenous peoples, which can then give us some really key input and contribution to the work that we're doing at ICVCM. I think without having this forum in place and without having these people that we can consult, we would not be able to understand the impact that we're having on Indigenous people and on local communities. So that is my presentation for you today, and I think at this point I'd like to hand over to Ross. Ross, over to you.
Hi everyone, pleased to join this event, and I'm going to run through I suppose a kind of summary of where we are with natural capital markets in Scotland, what we're trying to achieve, what we're doing, and some of the challenges we're facing in achieving that. And hopefully there are some common themes. Well, I'm sure there are some common themes about nature markets across the UK and across Europe and the wider world in terms of the challenges, but there are some particular flavours to the way we're approaching the work in Scotland and its context. So I want to touch on the context first, if we could have the next slide, please. So where are we in terms of Scotland and nature markets? Well, they haven't come out of nowhere, I would say. There's one of the things in Scotland is that there has been a long history of committing to a natural capital approach to policy. That stems from hosting the first World Forum on natural capital back in the early 2000s, and there've been a series of policy initiatives promoting a natural capital approach since. And it's very much set as investing in nature for wider benefit. I mean, people are well aware of that argument, but it needs to be fleshed out, I suppose. So we're looking at how we invest in nature to deliver economic, social, and environmental policy outcomes. So it's not just for environmental benefit, important though that is, it's very much looking at how that investment yields wider benefit to the policy outcomes in Scotland. In terms of the policy outcomes we're trying to achieve, of course, many of those are shared across the world in terms of, we've touched on climate change, mitigation and adaptation, we touched on nature restoration in response to the biodiversity crisis, but there are others. And in particular, I'd like to highlight in a Scottish context, which is relevant to the way we're taking forward natural capital markets, is the Scottish approach to land reform. So Scottish government for a long time has been taking forward policy to diversify land ownership so that more people are engaged in land management and it delivers a wider range of benefits. And in a related focus on community development. So we expect activities across Scotland to engage with local communities and yield benefits where that's appropriate. And that's no different to the expectation on natural capital markets. So those are things that are perhaps a particular focus in our policy context for nature markets that are slightly different to the rest of the UK and to what happens in other parts of the world. The kind of context for our approach as well is built on managing, not just securing the opportunities for policy delivery, but also managing the risks. I think that's the same everywhere, but it's often not stated very clearly that there are risks to be managed here, not just from greenwashing, but also from adverse impacts that any policy initiative can have on other policies, unless we think more widely. So we're looking to develop markets in a way that explicitly secures the opportunities and manage the risks, as I say. And that is set out, well, what does that mean? Because anybody can say that. We've tried to give that more meaning by setting out principles for responsible investment in natural capital. So last year we published draft interim principles in 2022, and last year we published kind of final principles for responsible investment in natural capital, and it sets out under 6 themes the behaviours and actions we expect from all market stakeholders in order to deliver that kind of responsible investment that secures the opportunities and manage the risks, to repeat myself ad infinitum. I suppose importantly, and this is a theme we might want to explore through questions, these are principles not just for private investment in natural capital, they are themes for public investment, as principles for public investment as well. And I think we need to keep in mind that many of the aspects of nature markets also apply to public interventions in land use and land management. And there's a shared agenda there that we need to keep in mind in terms of how we design nature markets and our expectation of nature markets alongside our expectation of public investment. Next slide, please. So what are we actually doing at the moment to try and increase responsible investment into nature? Our focus has been set out in the last year's Natural Capital Market Framework. If people want to refer to that, it's a more comprehensive suite of actions. But I'd highlight here the Ecosystem Restoration Code. So we are a government and a public sector partnership in Scotland are taking forward an action to try and develop a new route for investment into nature restoration. We have established routes for private investment into woodland creation and into peatland restoration. But there's a whole world of habitats, nature out there, which we need to invest in to restore and make sure it continues to deliver those economic, social and environmental benefits. And we don't have mechanisms in place for those. So we are looking to develop, or at least take forward, a mechanism by which a investment can happen into the restoration of a wider range of habitats. That work is now at the stage where we've completed an engagement phase and have got lots of really useful and often challenging feedback. So we're now at the point where we need to make a choice about, having had all that feedback, what is the sensible focus for this work in the next few months. We haven't yet finalized that decision, but as well as publishing the summary of the engagement we've had, which should happen in the next few weeks, we'll also be making public as soon as we can the direction of travel for this work until the next election in Scotland, which is in May next year. We know there are lots of people interested in it, so we want to be as clear as we can, as early as we can, on what we're doing. Carbon contracts is work that's happening around peatland restoration, and it's trying to develop a mechanism using public money in a slightly different way to more explicitly de-risk private investment into peatland restoration, to see whether that's a viable route to encourage more investment to happen, and also get better value for the public investment that's going into peatland restoration. That work is at the stage now where we're looking for projects to participate in the pilot exercise, and we're in discussion with those several projects, and we'll see what emerges from those. And again, we'll keep people updated on that as soon as we can. Other work we're doing, which is very similar, I think, to work that's happening certainly in the rest of the UK and probably more widely, is this investment prospectus. It's to try and find a means or a portal, I suppose, whereby we can better connect investors who are interested in investing in nature and projects that are looking for that investment, because we get feedback from both sides that they find it hard to communicate with their target audiences. So can we build a portal, a mechanism whereby those conversations can happen more frequently and effectively? So that's work that's underway. We're also, very similar to what's happening with UK government, who are funding Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. We have a Scottish version called Ferns, and the third round of that funding has just been committed. So there's a series of projects testing various aspects of market development, which we'll look to conclude by the end of this financial year. And again, we try to share the outcomes from that work as widely and as publicly as possible, as do, I know, UK government with their NERF funded research. So the more we can share and learn from each other, the better, I think, is a pretty sound principle. And the other actions we've got is, I mean, we've just heard a presentation about ICVCM and the very active work there. We need to keep alive to what's happening across the UK and what's happening internationally on market development, so that we, I suppose, adhere to the principles of high integrity. We want to show best practice in that regard, but also be alive to different aspects of market development, and make sure we kind of take best practice from others and learn from it. And if there are lessons where things haven't worked, we learn from those as well, rather than repeat them. The particular example, which is I suppose led to this webinar is the BSI program, where we've have regular contact with the UK government and the BSI team, which very helpfully adopting a kind of collaborative approach to this. And it's been really illuminating and helpful for us to be involved in that work and to contribute to its development. If I can move on to the next slide, please. So I've touched on some of these in going through kind of what we're doing. Many of our actions are to try and address challenges, but it's worth reiterating what these challenges are, because I'm sure others are scratching their heads about how to address them. So there is an issue about demand for nature markets. How do we generate investor interest and demand, which then leads to the scale of activity we want in order to address the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and all the other policy outcomes we want from a better natural environment. International market sentiment is a challenge. It's quite volatile, obviously affected by elections, in particular what happens in the US, but also, there'll be elections happening in Scotland, in Wales, in the UK. That's a kind of domestic market sentiment influenced by what happens there. But there's been a general retreat at an international level from some of the environmental commitments by the private sector, banks, investment houses. And that's led to perhaps some nervousness about the future of nature markets. So we need to keep an eye on that and be aware that there are nuances there. So some of these appears to be more of an appetite to continue investment in what is verifiably high integrity. So all the work that ICBCM and BSI are doing is really helpful in that regard. How do we increase the value of credits? Well, there are various thoughts on that. People are looking at stacking. So can we build on carbon credits by looking at biodiversity credits, water quality credits? What else can we add in to the package for a project that adds up to a bigger return for investors and therefore an increase in demand? And I've touched on it already. People talk about the high integrity premium or charismatic carbon, but is that really a thing? And if it is a thing, how do we design our markets so that they deliver that aspect effectively and secure investment? And then finally, a live debate at the moment, certainly in the UK, but I'm sure more widely, is the balance between compliance markets and voluntary markets. So are compliance markets a more effective way of establishing demand and therefore getting investment into the natural environment of the right kind to do the right thing? That's a live debate. Scotland, in contrast to UK government, we don't have compliance markets for nature at the moment. We don't have a biodiversity net gain or a nutrient budget market, but it's a live topic of discussion. There's an issue about supply. So where we have got investor interest, sometimes there isn't the kind of commitment from landowners or land managers to enter into these projects. A lot of that is down to continuing adaptation of policy to the leaving of the EU in the UK. That policy, replacement policy for what was in place under the EU is still evolving and being developed, and land managers are adapting to that. And then coming back to high integrity again, what do we mean by high integrity, having a shared understanding? That is an issue still, with a lot of market stakeholders talking at slightly cross purposes about what high integrity actually is. But the more that the BSI standards work evolves and the more that international standards work like ICBCM evolves, the better the answer we have to that and the more likelihood we'll have a shared understanding. So it's really good to see that work happen. The other challenge in here, which I haven't reflected, but I think needs to be captured, is again coming back to this point that nature markets don't operate in a vacuum. And when we're thinking about the design of nature markets, we need to think about the parallel design of public intervention into nature restoration. So just to reiterate that point, which I didn't cover in the slide. I'll leave it there, but hopefully there are some some reflections there of shared challenges with markets, but also some particular flavour of what we're trying to do in Scotland. And I'll pass on to Tom.
Thank you, Ross. What a lovely set of reflections for us to build on. So really lovely to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to talk specifically about the biodiversity aspect of that. So that sits within a nature market, and it's particularly around the enhancements, improvements for biodiversity. What I want to do, I want to start by talking about some work that we've been doing internationally, and then look at how that plays out more locally in the UK specifically, and then pull back out internationally again. So let's move on to the next slide, if that's okay. So last year, almost a year ago, this document was published by the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. I had an absolutely tiny role within this, but I think it's a really fantastic piece of work. This looked at what high integrity biodiversity markets would look like, and it set out a whole range of recommendations and requirements for that high integrity. We could have the whole rest of this webinar just on this report. I think it's well worth having a look at. They drew from all over the world. It was funded by the UK and French governments, and we had people from all over the world feeding into it. I'm just going to pull up the key recommendations on the next slide, if that's okay. And I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'm going to pull out 2 or 3 of them. I've put them up on the slide so that people have access to them, but also there's a link here that people can follow. What I wanted to do is just draw out a couple of these, or 3 of these, that I think are really critical within the biodiversity market, and actually do say something about the relationship that's different from the biodiversity market from some of the other parts of the nature markets, the carbon market, for example. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So one of the key pieces within this is the definition of a biodiversity credit. And what's important here is that this is built upon a whole range of work that the Biodiversity Credit Alliance has done, as well as this IAPB. So this is a huge group of organizations coming together to inform this. And what they've said is that biodiversity credit is a measurable, evidence-based unit of positive outcome for biodiversity that's durable and additional to what would have happened otherwise. Now we're going to pull that open a little bit and answer, or at least explore some of these. So measurable, evidence-based, positive outcome for biodiversity, durable and additional. This is really critical. So this definition actually frames an awful lot of what we're talking about in terms of this integrity. Let's move on to the next slide. The next piece I wanted to draw out was that these biodiversity credits, it's recognized, can be used in a number of different ways. And we've talked about voluntary or compliance markets. For biodiversity, actually the voluntary markets are tiny, almost next to nothing. Whereas the compliance market is huge. If you think about all of the work that's done in terms of offsetting impacts through ECIAs, that's ecological impact assessment, environmental assessment, and so on. This is really critical in terms of delivering and driving demand for improvements in biodiversity. Now, there are 3 places where biodiversity credits can be playing out. One is contributing to nature goals more widely, so that might be contributing to our 30 by 30 target. The second here is flagged is this compensation for impacts, and that's where a lot of the work ends up happening. We'll come to that in a moment in a bit more detail as well with an English example. And then there's insetting, which is about businesses assessing impacts along their supply chains and working about how they can mitigate and address those impacts. So that was recognized within this. If we move on to the next slide. So this means that it's quite a varied market. And has quite a lot of avenues for delivery and quite a lot of different ways that these biodiversity credits can be used and delivered, which makes this high integrity piece challenging, but also even more important. Now, the last piece I wanted to draw out from here is that what this states is really critical, and this is one of the pieces that we discussed quite a lot in the groups. in developing this document. What this states is that the IAPB does not support trading biodiversity credits across the world. That those biodiversity approach when dealing with offsetting, so this is very specific, when dealing with offsetting, so dealing with an impact and compensating for that impact, the biodiversity credit needs to be local and needs to be what's termed like for like, delivering for the same community of species, the same ecosystems as you're impacting. Now, this is really important because it is a significant difference from some of the other nature markets that we've got, and especially from the carbon market. This means that we're much more likely to get a large number of local markets rather than one global market. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, one of these local markets is playing through something called Biodiversity Net Gain, which is playing out very heavily in England at the moment, but it's not an England-only piece of work. Actually, it's a piece of work that came out from the Business and Biodiversity Offsetting Programme, global approach, so a whole range of global actors looking at this. We've got some really interesting biodiversity gain policy requirements in Australia, similarly in parts of Germany, France, etc. But what is Biodiversity Net Gain? Well, it's a project or a development that results in improvement in biodiversity, an increase in biodiversity. And what's important here is this is not just one measure, although that measurable piece is critical based on what we've just heard from the international panel, but it's also set out supported by a range of principles. If we move on to the next slide, please. Now, these are the UK principles, but there's an equivalent globally as well. These principles talk about being additional. You can see that there's a mirror here. Yes, there's a similarity with what we've got in that global documentation. We've got a measurable change that needs to be made. We've got to make sure that there's a legacy, a long-term outcome. All of these things link back and reinforce the high integrity requirements that are set out by the international panel. Now, this is how this is playing out within England. And these principles run across the UK. Now, how this was developed has been heavily supported by the development of standards. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Those principles have were written and then taken and used to inform a British standard that is called Process for Designing and Implementing Biodiversity Net Gain Specification. That's BS 8683 if anybody's looking for it. There's also a little book on biodiversity net gain that's on the BSI website that you can download for free and have a look, and it gives you an overview of the standard. But the point is the standard has taken this good practice, those principles, and the approach to biodiversity net gain, not just in England, but globally, and looked at how that can be played out. And that then has further informed how the policy has been developed within England and elsewhere, and how it's being explored within Scotland, as we've heard, and wider. And to the point, that wider point, if we move on to the next slide, please, this is now being taken and being adapted into an international standard. Not a very pretty slide, sorry. This is because it's still in press. It's about to come out this autumn. So again, where has this come from? It's come from all of the expertise that we brought together through the British Standard work, through the international panels, and then we've worked across countries through the ISO process to develop a standard that's going to work everywhere. Now, this is really exciting, but it's just a start for these nature markets. It's one way a nature market can be framed in terms of biodiversity net gain. But we also need other aspects. We need to understand how these markets can play out, not just in the compensation market, but also in the insetting market and contributing towards wider goals. And for that reason, we're developing standards specifically for the biodiversity market, as we heard about earlier, funded by DEFRA, supported by BSI. Let's move on to the next slide, please, or led by BSI, to develop nature markets specifications. And we've heard that we've got this overarching one, 701. We've then got others on carbon, and this one is on biodiversity. This is one I've been heavily involved with. And this is looking at how we develop nature markets and what high integrity looks like from the supply side specifically. So when you're supplying, when you're developing and creating that biodiversity credit, what does that look like? Move on to the next slide, please. And that is setting out a whole range of specifications around transparency, around how we quantify units. Now, we're not going to specify one metric over another, but we do need to make sure that how you quantify units is really clear, really robust, and is comparable across your project. And if you're delivering that project as compensation for an impact elsewhere, across the impact site as well as your project, so that we can see this real clarity and deliver that like-for-like requirement that was set out, that make sure that we're delivering these lasting benefits. And to come back to this point about the engagement that was flagged earlier with the communities, whether that be in Scotland or Indigenous peoples globally, this point about making sure that we've got avoiding unintended consequences, that we're not having negative impacts by delivering positive outcomes for biodiversity, is really, really critical as well, and embedded throughout this. Now, as we've said, this is coming out soon. There's a draft on the website at the moment, but an updated draft off the back of a whole load of comments will be out later this year, early next, I believe. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you. And I'm going to pass on to Sean.
Thank you, Tom. I'm Sean Doyle. I'm a research scientist at the Water Institute in Louisiana over in the States, and I'll be talking a bit about how we're working with the state government over here in Louisiana to try to move towards a financially viable blue carbon market. Next slide, please. Yep, here we go. So a little background, Louisiana is facing a coastal crisis. We have an enormous amount of land loss over the last 80 years, largely caused by the leveeing of the Mississippi River. So it's no longer delivering sediment to our coast. It just shoots out into the Gulf of Mexico. And we've lost almost 1,900 square miles of land in the last 80 years and projected to lose substantially more. Next slide. So to put that in perspective, this is a current map of Louisiana, and under a future with no action to try to prevent this issue, the red area is land that will no longer be here about 50 years from now if we do nothing. And the green is a few areas where the river, the Atchafalaya River in central Louisiana, and then over down there in the Bird's Foot is the little amount of land that the Mississippi is currently building. Next slide, please. And just to give you an example, this is an example of land loss that occurred a few years ago from a single hurricane event. Hurricane Ida in August wiped out an enormous amount of area over in an area called the Delta Farmlands, which is a little bit south of New Orleans for perspective. Next slide, please. So Louisiana has known about this problem for a long time, and so we have, I would argue, one of the best government agencies in the country to try to address this problem, called the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. And I believe we're the only state in the country that have developed a coastal master plan that's updated every 6 years, with which details hundreds of different projects from sediment diversions, levee building, seawall building, as well as marsh creation and ridge restoration projects to try to save our coast. Next slide, please. So the current plan is projected to cost about $50 billion. About a little less than half of that funding is currently secured. And of the type of projects, about half is for restoring natural environments that we've lost, and the other half is for risk reduction to reduce the risks of floods from major storms. For example, the type of flooding we saw after Katrina about 20 years ago. Next slide, please. So the problem we have is that's a $50 billion plan with only a little less than half paid for. So one area that's a big push right now, I'd say maybe the last 3 or 4 years, is to look into the viability of blue carbon financing mechanisms to raise more revenue to support more of the master plan projects. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background on wetland blue carbon is there's two main pools you really have to think about. Is carbon that's being captured by plant growth each year, and then in wetlands, the real big one is soil carbon. This is quite different from forest markets where all the biomass and carbon is being stored in the leaves and the trunks and the trees above ground. Wetlands store about 90% of the carbon in the soil, and some of these carbon stocks are enormous. There's areas in Louisiana where you can drill down 1 meter of soil and find carbon that's 5,000 or 6,000 years old. So these ecosystems are storing an enormous amount of carbon. Next slide. The issue is with all this land loss and the dynamic coast is what happens to this soil carbon after land loss? Does it go back to the atmosphere? Does it get reburied somewhere else? We don't know. So that's a big issue from a permanence point of view in blue carbon. And then another issue that has to deal with monitoring costs under current standards has to do with methane flux being highly variable and expensive to measure. I'll get into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So as part of this effort to find out whether we can move towards a blue carbon market in Louisiana, we've been working with the state to group all the master plan projects in various groups based on their technical and financial feasibility under current standards. And not just one standard, we're looking at as many that are potentially applicable. And so some of these are right now, the standards don't provide a clear path forward to sell or develop identifiable carbon benefits from the project, while others are highly feasible, and we could probably move towards accrediting those projects right now. And what I want to talk a little bit about is about these white arrows of what things can we do to try to move projects from a low feasibility group into a higher feasibility group. Next slide, please. So the first one we've been thinking about is reducing the cost of the accreditation process. I won't talk about all the details. The big one here is the first one is using numerical modeling. The current standards that are applicable to blue carbon require you to have a baseline area to know how much land you have and then compare it to another area where maybe you take some kind of project action to protect the coast. That's very challenging because one area of wetland that's maybe just a few kilometers away might be very different from somewhere else. And so one potential way to reduce that cost of having to have both baseline and project areas is to have scientifically defensible numerical models to project what your baseline land loss is going to be, and then potentially your blue carbon project could be trying to prevent that land loss and selling credits on top of that. Next slide. Another one is reducing the cost of project monitoring. I mentioned this earlier. The big one here I'll talk about is methane. So far to date, there's only been one blue carbon project attempted in Louisiana. It was a small pilot project in a swamp outside of New Orleans. And that project failed because the standards required that methane flux, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, about 30-fold stronger than CO2, has to be measured because of the amount of methane that comes out of these wetlands. And the cost of measuring methane is so expensive that it often, all the financial benefit you'll get from selling carbon credits will be used just to pay for the monitoring. So the project is not financially viable. So there's some work to do here, especially in medium salinity wetlands where there's a lot of methane flux, to find cheaper ways to measure methane or project it accurately so that we don't have to deploy methane sensors out in the marsh and use up all the potential benefit from the carbon credits in just paying for making the project viable to begin with. Next slide. Another one, this is a big one. I'd say is the largest lift going forward, but it's increasing the yield of carbon units. This has to do with permanence. with all this land loss, right now, none of the standards have great guidance on how to deal with the fact that your carbon can move around in a wetland. If you're doing a green carbon project and you're just crediting a forest, whether you just have to make sure it doesn't burn down or it doesn't get cut down. In a wetland, what happens if you're doing carbon creditation, for example, in a barrier island, and a hurricane moves the island and it's outside of your project footprint? Right now, there's not great guidance for that in the standards. Also, like I mentioned earlier, what is the fate of eroded soil carbon? Does it go back to the atmosphere and that's all lost permanence, or does it get reburied somewhere? Right now, we don't know. So more scientific research into the fate of eroded carbon could provide a potential huge benefit of crediting avoided carbon loss by, for example, building a barrier island that doesn't generate much carbon on its own, but protects 1,000 hectares of wetland from being blown away by a hurricane. Next slide, please. And the last potential area where you can increase the financial viability of a project goes back to one of the earlier panelists, is stacking or stapling, sometimes refer in some markets, biodiversity credits on top of projects. So there's one project that's being piloted for this right now in Louisiana, which was a cypress reforestation effort. And right now it is, they're not trying to actually sell the biodiversity credits, just pilot how many can be generated by monitoring whether there are any biodiversity gains by this reforestation effort, and then just look at the viability of stapling or stacking biodiversity credits onto a blue carbon project. Next slide. Okay, this is my last one. This is pretty busy, but an overview. So of the master plan projects that might be viable for blue carbon, down at the bottom, this is the lowest hanging fruit, but lowest yield of blue carbon. This is basically crediting the new plant growth you get from when you build a marsh. It's not a huge yield because for grasses, you can only credit 1 year of grasses because they senesce every year. Trees give you a little bit more because they're permanent. Group A and Group B are the high risk but high reward. If we can move there, they're not currently technically or financially feasible, but this would be a situation where you can build some type of land bridge or marsh creation project that protects a large area of the coast from being eroded away, and then crediting that protected carbon of no longer be at risk of erosion and emission to the atmosphere. But we need more scientific research to make that viable. And next slide. Thank you very much. So I think I'm the last panelist, so I'll invite the rest of the panelists to join me for the Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thank you to all our panelists. A great job was done there, an amazing amount of information provided. We've got about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes to ask some questions. So we've had some come in, so we're going to go through those if that's okay. I'm going to start with quite a general one, which I'm going to start with Kate, and then it'd be great to get some other views from the rest of you. But Kate, in your session, you mentioned the sort of reason why standards were very valuable was because they help build trust and confidence. And I just wondered how whilst building that trust and confidence via standards, how can you do that without adding cost and complexity?
Okay, so yes, obviously, as we said before, putting standards in place gives a common understanding around ways of operating, around the principles needed and the thresholds needed globally for quality, and introduces greater transparency around governance. So it really helps the buyers know if they have a credit that has a tag or associated with the standard that is associated with the credit. Sorry, I started with the wrong way around with that. It's really useful for buyers to know if a credit has a tag which is associated with a standard. But when developing the standard, I think what you've got to understand is that the people involved do consider all of the aspects such as what can be achieved by the markets. So it's not a case of doing the highest possible, the most difficult possible threshold you can, but it's about getting that balance right. And if I look, for example, at the ICVCM work, when the CCPs and the assessment framework were developed, they set some robust requirements, but they were a balance of ambition with pragmatism. And that was to try and help the market, help that systemic shift in the market. So you're not immediately giving a shock to the market of complexity. And so you're trying to understand what your stakeholders need to do. You're trying to get something in place which will help those stakeholders, but will also help the people who need to buy the credits. But at the same time, the intention, for example, with ICVCM is that they'll improve and strengthen the assessment framework and slowly raise that market to a consistent level of quality and integrity, but without shocking the market with something that's really complex and really difficult to achieve.
Thank you, Kate. Tom, oh, that was badly timed, just as you're taking a drink of water, but did you have a view you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. What I'm struck by is that in the, I think it's the 80s, when the health and safety regulations came through across Europe, lots of people said, oh, this is going to undermine businesses. We're not going to be able to operate. It's far too complicated to fill in all these risk assessments. And now we wouldn't think of doing anything else because it's about the safety and integrity of the people we work with. And risk assessments are straightforward and so on. We are going through a transition at the moment. And it's really important that when we think about the cost of delivering these things, we also think about the cost of not doing so. What's the cost of not net zero? What's the cost of damaging the environment? And I think from Sean's examples, you can see that if we don't put in place these right outcomes for nature, our cities won't be livable, our homes won't be safe in the way that they are at the moment, and our crops won't be able to produce the food we need and so on. So yes, we need to balance the cost. We need to get that right so that the market are going to be able to adopt it and build on what they're already doing to add an extra bit, which is exactly what we did with Biodiversity Net Gain. Not reinvent the whole assessment for ecology, but we add a bit onto it that gives a quantification, that gives some clarity on what we're doing. And then we can build from that.
That's a great,
and that's exactly what the standards are doing.
Yeah, no, great comparison to health and safety. Actually, I really like that, Tom. It's a real life success story, that, and actually this hopefully this will go the same way. Ross, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not really. I suppose just to add in, there's a kind of cost benefit judgment, isn't there? So, and we talk about the need for high integrity. That has to come with some meaning, and there will be a financial cost to provide that. Mm-hmm. But what is the alternative? To say, as Tom said, we need a high integrity market for all sorts of reasons, for investors to have confidence, but also for governments to be confident that these markets are delivering policy goals, as well as kind of financial returns. And I think we must accept that there will be a cost. How reasonable or otherwise that is, I suppose, is the judgment, not that there won't be a cost. Because if we want integrity to have a meaning, then there must be some investment in it.
Yeah. Sean, you can try and add to that, or I've got another one here which I think builds on that, quite interesting from an opposite angle. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think Ross and Tom and Kate covered that perfectly.
Yeah, so why don't you go first with this one, which is sort of what new opportunities do nature markets create for investment, innovation and positive impact, which I think is quite a good flip from how people are concerned about what cost it might create. So thinking about the investment side.
Yeah, so maybe I'm a little biased in this answer, where I see a lot of the innovation, at least from a blue carbon point of view, is ways that we can reduce costs to monitor projects through using new technologies that are currently not available. So remote sensing, AI, numerical modeling as well. For biodiversity, a big one that we're involved in is, for example, using eDNA technologies to quantify biodiversity at scale, which is very difficult to do by putting boots on the ground ecologists in the field, especially if you have a project area that is quite large. So I think those are from a science point of view, and of course I'm a scientist, so that's what I'm going to think of. There's a lot of innovation on that side of the market, I think.
Thanks, Sean. Anybody else want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I suppose I reflected on in my presentation, there's a lot to learn, the sort of cross-pollination across the public and private sector about investment in nature and management of nature restoration, and getting a different range of expertise and perspectives coming in through the private sector, sometimes just through market development, but also, sometimes through targeted grant funds. So the NERF fund that DEFRA manage for UK government and the Ferns scheme we have are looking at innovative ways of addressing problems for private investment that have wider application. So I would point to how we get land managers to collaborate to achieve scale. I mean, that's something that public initiatives have been trying to achieve for a long time, and it's really difficult. And now there's private investment initiatives sort of testing slightly different techniques or bringing a different perspective to it. So I think across the board, there's a kind of a lot of shared learning from private sector interest and development of markets that we can learn from and apply in the kind of public initiatives as well.
Great, thank you. Tom, did you want to come in on that?
Thank you. Yeah, if I may. There's a lot of businesses that I'm working with at the moment that are looking at both their operations and their value chain and identifying their dependencies on nature and the risks associated with that. And so to turn that on its head, there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to work with nature, to see it as part of your infrastructure, if you like, to enable your business to operate smoothly and resiliently over climate change futures. And so there's an opportunity to remove business risk by investing in nature. And so I think that's starting to play out quite significantly in small specific places, and I'm sure it's going to grow. And that plays back directly to what Ross is saying about then working across catchments to decrease flood risk or decrease drought risk, or work across areas using bioacoustics or eDNA to sample and measure change so that you can get an idea of how this ecosystem is supporting your road, railway, town, whatever it might be. So I think those opportunities are growing rapidly.
Thank you. Anybody else want, Kate or Sean, do you want to come in on that one? No? Okay. We have had one just come in. Sorry, go on, Kate. No, we have just had one come in, which is what are the key investment risks for companies purchasing long-term carbon sequestration, I can't say it, credits, and how can standards mitigate them? Does anybody fancy answering that one? Tom, you're nodding. You don't want to nod, I come straight to you. Go on, Tom.
The reason I was nodding is because we've just invested, Arup has just invested in some long-term carbon store within the UK, and charismatic carbon, so delivering positive outcomes for biodiversity, water and so on, but we're effectively paying for the carbon. We're in a very lucky position in the sense that we're managing our own carbon budget, as it were, and the funding that comes through that coming from our travel and offices and things like that. But what that means is that we're paying now for the carbon that we're going to draw down in 2029 through to 2040. So one of the ways we've mitigated that risk is not only underestimating the carbon that we'll actually get from that land and working with third parties like Nattergal and Wilder Carbon to do that, but also paying for it now to draw it down once it's mature and there and we can point to it. So we've been very careful for ourselves in trying to manage that risk and share that risk between ourselves, the landowners, and not play it all in one place. But it's something that we still need to work through.
Thank you very much. Sean, I was wondering if I could ask you something we got in advance of the webinar today was what standards would you hope to see emerge for the advancement of MNG?
Yeah, so I spoke about this in my slides. For marine net gain, which is what MNG stands for, is going to be those innovative technologies that allow us to actually quantify what's happening on the ground in the environment. So, for example, eDNA, remote sensing, et cetera. Right now, I would argue that the standards for blue carbon and maybe marine net gain, they still have a legacy from a green carbon perspective of forests in the ground and upland environments. And so I think some of those legacy effects of blue carbon standards being almost developed from green carbon standards is creating some difficulties, not recognizing how different blue carbon ecosystems can be. And so I think a key thing going forward for blue carbon standards will be unified standards that we can all agree on. So a ton of carbon from one wetland is certifiably the same as a ton of carbon from another wetland, but also recognizing we need flexibility in our standards to recognize that a mangrove forest in Southeast Asia probably doesn't behave the same way as a salt marsh in South Louisiana.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a view on that they'd like to share, or do we leave that with Sean, our expert on such things? Okay. Another question we've had sent in is, what are the roles and responsibilities of buyers and investors in nature markets? Ross or Tom, I was wondering if I could start with either of you. Go on, Ross, you go first.
Well, that's quite a broad question.
I know, it's a good one, isn't it?
Well, it's also, can you just repeat it again?
Take a slice. What are the roles and responsibilities of buyers and investors in nature markets? Okay.
Well, we've tried to set that out, as others have, in the form of principles. So I referenced the Principles for Responsible Investment in Nature, which we published last year following an interim version in 2022, and that does seek to set out for each category of stakeholder in markets a kind of series of behaviors that we would want them to take. So some of that is also translating through into the BSI standards. So when you look at the design of the standards, it does say, give an indication at the start and saying, well, which stakeholders should look at these standards and seek to comply with them. So I think there's I won't repeat the detail in there, but in thinking about buyers and investors and the critical role they play in markets, then there are documents out there that set out the particular expectations that governments are seeking, and the BSI standards also set out expectations on the range of criteria within the emerging standards that are relevant to them.
Tom, did you want to add to that?
Very briefly, just to say that the nature market standards we've been developing under BSI are supplier-led, but they do point toward an understanding of what you might need to do as an investor or as a buyer, because you need your suppliers to be high integrity if you're going to be investing in something that's high integrity. And that comes back to that transparency, that clarity. So I think actually those supplier-led standards that are coming through are a really good place to start as an investor to say, well, actually, are we buying something that meets the high integrity bar that BSI have set?
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more, which really picks up on, and it's one that was submitted prior to the event, but it picks up on, Kate, you were talking about Indigenous populations, and the question was, how can we address the impact of nature investments on society, including local communities? Have you got a bit more that you'd like to say about that?
Yes, absolutely. So we've worked very closely with Indigenous peoples and local communities right from the start on ICVCM. So even when we were developing the core carbon principles, when we were developing the framework that is associated with it, it's really key for us to get the comments and feedback from those communities and to understand how what we were developing would actually impact them. So it's from day one that we were engaging very closely with the communities. And it was at that point that we realized actually that we needed something more than that, and that's how the forum was set up, because we need someone we can consult on all the different aspects, but not just sort of picking out one group of people. This does affect people in different regions in different ways. So I think it's really key that we continue to consult with Indigenous peoples, with local communities, and try and understand those impacts. We can't just guess them ourselves without speaking to the people who are involved and who understand what the issues are.
Thanks, Kate. Tom, I was told that you might have a view on this as well.
Oh, I have a view on everything, Anne.
I know, I'm learning that.
I'm sorry. I think there's an interesting document that's worth looking at that IUCN produced about biodiversity net gain. Now, I know that's not our standards we're talking about today, but what it states there is that delivering biodiversity net gain should not have a negative impact on local communities. And that's in the way you're impacting the site and where you're compensating the site. We need to look at that very carefully. And that needs to be played out through all of this work. We cannot look after nature and forget people, or look after people and forget nature. We've got to do the two together.
Thank you.
And
Sean and Ross, go on, Ross.
Yeah, I just add to that. I mean, I think that's a challenge again for public interventions and public management of land. That same principle applies about having regard to community engagement and community benefits and impacts. Domestically, I point to, I suppose, what we're trying to do in Scotland is develop a suite of best practice examples. So I think one of the challenges is, what do we mean and what is proportionate in terms of engagement with communities around nature projects? And the Scottish Land Commission produced some really good guidance seeking to set out different best practice or good practice examples in different types of nature project. So when people have asked us for kind of an idea of what we mean by our expectations on community engagement and community benefits, then we point to that publication as kind of first source.
Thanks, Ross. Sean, have you covered this in the work in the US?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Tom was mentioning about, is you have to consider both people and nature. The big one we have in Louisiana is, if you're building land, you're taking away open water where native communities are often subsistence fishermen. And so it's critically important that you talk to the people who are going to lose their fisher grounds because you built a marsh in that area. And so that has been an important lesson learned. We've learned in Louisiana over the last 15 years of the Coastal Master Plan, as engaging the community through the process from the very beginning, from planning. Otherwise, people get upset and projects get canceled, and then everyone loses.
Yeah. Thank you. Unfortunately, I have to close the quick Q&A session now, but I just really want to thank all of you, so Kate, Tom, Sean and Ross, for your contributions today. Also, just for those who are joining us today, I wanted to make you aware that BSI is running a process to pilot the Nature Market Principle Standard, which is BSI Flex 701, which will work with selected parties between October this year and March 26. So any organisation or individual involved in the generation, trading or storage of nature credits within the UK markets is welcome to apply to this. And you can do this by clicking on or take a picture of the QR code on the screen now, or we'll also put a link to it in the chat. So finally, a massive thanks to you all for being here. We've got a number of talks going on over the rest of the week in our Net Zero week, so I hope that you're able to join those. Big thanks to the speakers and to answering our questions, and we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Cheers.